welcome to York Festival of Ideas. Gosh, that sounds a bit echoey. Is it all right for you? It's good. My name is Pickett. I'm Professor of Epidemiology in the Department of Health Sciences here at York. And I lead the Public Health and Society Research Group at the Born in Bradford Centre for Social Change. And I'm chairing the event today, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all. Before I introduce you to Danny, just going to run through some essential housekeeping. In the unlikely event of an emergency, please follow the steward's instructions. They will tell you what to do, and that's all I need to say about it. Can I also ask you to put your phones on silence for the session, please? Okay, it's my great pleasure to introduce Danny Dorling to you. He is Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography at the University of Oxford. He's an old friend and colleague, so it's good to spend time on the platform with him. He appears regularly on TV and radio. He writes for The Guardian, New Statesman and other woke papers. He has written a number of books, but his new book, The Next Crisis, What We Think About the Future, is going to be the topic of our conversation today, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Danny, as I'm sure you are as well. But I thought I'd start by asking if anybody in the audience would like to share, what is it that you are most worried about at this time? Your number one worry? Anybody? Stick up a hand up or shout one out. Yes? Inequality. Inequality is your number one worry. Has anyone got a different one?
Trump.
Trump.
Climate change.
Climate change.
Rise of the far right.
The rise of the far right.
Seconded.
Another pandemic. What was that one?
Seconded to the rise of the far
Seconding the rise of the far right. I'll tell you mine at the end of this session, and Danny might share his biggest fear with you. But I must say that mine have changed very much over time. When I lived in America, when I was a young adult, I worried all the time about affording things, whether or not I was going to become ill because I didn't have medical insurance. And my worries have really changed over time. But Danny's book is all about what people all over the world worry about, and what we should think about that. So, can you start off, Danny, by telling us why you say it is that worrying and feeling about that we're in a crisis is actually a luxury?
Okay. I'm just trying to see. I don't think I've got so much of an echo, but if anybody's worrying about echoing, wave at me. No, you seem okay. The idea that this worry about crisis is a luxury came to me from two sources. The first was looking at the frequency with which we talk about crises over time, and I did the simplest thing, which is you do a Google Ngram for the various words. If you do that, the word crisis was very little used in the past and in other languages, not just English. It rose a bit in the 1930s, dropped after the Second World War, and then absolutely ramped up in the 60s, which fits the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it went up again in the 70s, and up again in the 80s, and up again in the 90s, and up all the way to when that data source ended, which was the year 2019, when we were using the word crisis more than ever before. And we know it's going to go up again because the pandemic came after that. And it's also used more in richer countries and by richer people. So it could be that we're living in a time of continuous polycrisis, or it could be that since the 1960s, more and more of us have had time to worry about crises, what could happen, partly because for most of us, our countries were not at war, things were not going terribly wrong. This isn't the 19th century. It's not typhoid, then cholera, then influenza again. You know, there used to be pandemics and epidemics all the time. There used to be wars in Europe all the time. So if you're being optimistic about things, and I try and be optimistic in this book, the talk of multiple crises now is partly because we have enough space to worry about what is happening and the ability to think we can address it, rather than simply having to live through reality, which is just reality, and it's not a crisis because it's bad, but that's just what life is like. To worry about crises is a luxury. Just under half the world's population are worrying about how they're going to get through the next few days. Will they have enough? You know, it'll be rude to give them a survey and say, of these 18 things, what worries you the most? To people who aren't going to have enough food by tonight. So the surveys that I've mainly based the book on are of the world's middle class, 3 billion people in effect, and what they worry about. But when you hear what the world's middle class worry about, you may be surprised, because here in this room we are well above that. We're in the top 1 or 2% of the world's income distribution on average. Not everybody in the room, but you know, you tend to be better off if you've come to a talk at a university on a night. And so what most of the world's middle class worry about is not all of the things that you said when Kate polled you. There was one conspicuous one missing, which was number 2. But we'll get to that.
So you've analysed global polling data, and you're trying to understand what people are really genuinely concerned about. But you found some real surprises.
Yeah.
And really there's a gap, isn't there, between what the media headlines tell us the crises are and what the public are actually concerned about.
There is. I was surprised by these things. I'll give you the order. And this is the Ipsos kind of order of the last 10 years. It does change slowly. I also looked at what risk managers say are the biggest crises, and I look at mortality data, because one way of measuring how important something is how many people does it kill. The polls, which are taken every month in about 30 countries, including India, and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences also conducts its poll every 2 years, very similar questions. So we can get most of the world's population, but only a few countries in Africa, only a few countries in South America. The polls show that in the last 10 years, inequality and poverty, the lady who first spoke was right, inequality and poverty has come to the top. I was utterly surprised. I was utterly shocked that given a lot of options, more people would have that in their top 3 than anything else. And it's a concern, it's a worry for their nation. Not necessarily for themselves, but for the neighbourhood, the people that they live with. And that was a shock, because, as you know, inequality is a really difficult thing to get people to worry about, because it's getting people to worry about a gap. Poverty is easier. Ipsos, bless them, put the two together. In very recent years, halfway through the pandemic, cost of living rapidly rose up to be the top, but inequality and poverty are still number 2. I lump them all together because cost of living and inequality and poverty, I think, are the same thing. My major agency in this book, my only power, has been deciding what things to put together which creates a different story. So that was the first surprise, because I've been involved with many other people over years trying to get people to worry about inequality, and then to look at it and go, actually they do, and they didn't always. This has been a success story. The second thing which shocked me, and then I felt really, really bad about myself, is that the second biggest concern of the middle class of the world is unemployment. And I felt really bad about myself because I work in the university sector. As this university is affected. Half my friends and colleagues in the UK are worrying about their jobs, but I sit in a university where it's very hard to sack us. And it isn't just people of my age worrying about unemployment. My last stereotyping view, I pretend, but a fair proportion of you are beyond the age in which you're worrying about having a job, which may be why nobody mentioned unemployment. And of course, people worry for their children about unemployment. And university students worry about unemployment because they're really worried about whether somebody's going to want them. Now, they may be in their heads in China right now, when there's a crisis, small crisis of unemployment, they may be worrying, I'm not going to get the kind of job I thought I was going to get by going to university. But they're certainly taking it up as a concern. And so what looking at polls does and what looking at different countries does is it forces you to put something that you had pushed down in your mind. You know, I began my research in the late 1980s at a time when we were still living with mass youth unemployment. If you remember when it had got to 3 million and it was the biggest thing going. And I think in my head, unemployment has become less and less of an issue. Partly as I personally have been further away from it, but also we adapt. If we're not actually affected, we just go, oh, that's just part of the landscape. Or we go, oh, we've got a really low unemployment rate, so it mustn't be a problem. We have a really low unemployment rate in the UK because you have to have a job, because you can't survive on benefits, not because we have a great job market. We have people doing 2 or 3 jobs. We have a population in the UK, and it's the same in most other countries surveyed, that are really worried about unemployment. So that's 1 and 2. Now, it's important to emphasise that.
Let's dig into that cost of living crisis a bit more. In your book, you're suggesting that that's telling us something deeper about inequality.
Yeah.
What is our anxiety about everyday expenses? What's that telling us about society?
It's people worrying a lot about themselves getting by. The fundamental worry of cost of living, inequality and poverty is, will I get by, will I have enough? It's people worrying about themselves. This is the middle class, about the cost of medicines, about paying the rent, but also worrying that they're living in a society where that is becoming obviously harder for others around them. Now, it gets to the top because this is ticked more often than many, many other things as a concern. And it wasn't there 20, 25 years ago. So this is an effect of greater awareness, not necessarily the media, but enough people saying it matters. And I suppose Trump and the billionaires may have helped, but my data ends just before Donald stood up. What was it, 5 of the 7 richest men in the world stood behind him? I mean, they're kind of making it nice and easy for us, over, showing who's on what side. But it's a literal fear of getting enough to get by. Food, rent, clothes, and that kind of thing, which I've looked at in Britain in great detail for many years. Seeing it as a priority in enough countries in the rest of the world to realise this is a global top issue was a shock. It isn't necessarily the top issue where it should be. So there are countries like the United States where it's less of an issue because people think they're getting by. Or you can take India, which has the most positive population in the world, where people really think, on average, that Modi's government is doing something very, very good for them, because Modi's government tells them they're doing something very good for them. Although that cracked slightly at the last election. So you get all these geographical nuances, but above that, evened out, for most of the world, the problem is we're really worried about getting by, if not for us, for those around us. The one country where it doesn't rank anywhere near the top is a country which is as unequal as the United States, but where everybody is so much better off than their grandparents. And that country is China, where even though China has great inequality, and the President talks about the problem of inequality, people don't put it as their top concern because we're all better off. I think this is my interpretation. The top concern in China is healthcare. And my suspicion, again, it's very hard to prove things, so I'm careful, I think, in the book to say when I'm making an assumption and when we know things. It's partly having a very elderly population. The average young person in China has 4 grandparents and they're their only grandchild. You can see why they might worry about healthcare. And it may also, although I'm very careful in the book about this, I'll tell you, but I suspect that to navigate your way through part of the Chinese health system does require bribes. People people anecdotally tell you. And if you know that if your relative is seriously ill and you can't come up with some money, and other things are sorted out in your society, no war, almost no violence, a job for everybody, incredible economic progress, something always rises to the top of our concerns. There aren't many places in the world where people are sitting back and going, I don't worry about anything at all.
Well, you know what nobody did mention at the start when I asked what people worry about? Nobody in this lovely audience said migration, immigration. I suspect that would be different in many audiences in the UK today. And you do explore in the book how fears about employment, unemployment, and immigration are linked.
Yeah.
Are those concerns being manipulated?
Oh, yeah.
And what's the reality behind that rhetoric?
So, on its own, immigration is a kind of medium-level fear, along with climate change. Whether climate change is dropping as a concern in the world when we poll people. The UK is rarely number one at many things. We are number one by a mile on believing climate change is real. We have the least climate skeptics on the planet, 9%. So if your representative, I won't ask the 9% of people in this room who believe it's all made up and it isn't getting warmer, but
Stand up now, please.
yeah, but on that, and that's partly manipulation, good manipulation, an agreement between Sky and the BBC and the other major media outlets not to do balance. They used to put the sceptic up against the scientists, right? We don't do that. An agreement which may be breaking down, but an agreement between the political parties not to debate the reality of this. Now, you could see that as manipulation. I think it's good manipulation, but it's certainly, our belief in climate change really mattering in the UK occurred partly because of agreements amongst our elite. Immigration is the other way around. It's groups working out that how do we stop people being concerned about inequality or poverty or cost of living? Well, we just blame it on them. If they didn't come, it'd all be great. If they didn't come, we'd have enough houses. If they didn't come, our schools would be fine. If they didn't come, imagine if all those immigrants weren't here. All that food in the co-op that you could have that they wouldn't be eating, right? And it's almost as base as that. You tell people that immigrants work less hard than the people here. They're less skilled, less productive. They're a drain on society. I'm thinking of a particular ex-academic colleague of mine doing very well on Substack doing this. I turned down an invite from GB News actually today to go on with him at 4 o'clock. And I was really kind. In the end, I just said no. My original email to the producer at GB News was, if you need any help trying to get another job somewhere else, I'm willing to try to help you. And I thought, no, that's patronising and horrible, and they've obviously thought about this, and they don't need absolutely not, but what I can do is try to help you not work for GB News. But GB News is funded by rich people who want you to be scared about immigration. Not very far from here is an old man who watches GB News incessantly, and every time he meets me, he asks me, what are we going to do about the small boats? Right? And he's quite high up in North Yorkshire. So, the small boats are going to get into the Vale of York first, long after the sea level rises, which is, I'm looking at Richard because sea level average 20 centimetres. You can work out when it's going to get up the Vale of York, but, to get up to the Dales is quite some time. But, yeah, we're manipulators. I suspect most of you know. And it rises in the UK in elections, but you can see this around the world. It's interesting to watch who are the baddies for each country. When you go into Eastern Europe, it's people from further east and so on. And these stories about what bad news it is when people come. I'll just give you one example. If people are coming to where you live it's generally good news. Almost always. Like, you can try and find an example when it isn't. Because it's not just that they're coming because they'll do something, but they're going to require services as well, so it has a multiplier effect. I was asked once on local radio in Doncaster to explain, when we produced an atlas of immigration, why were there so many Germans in Doncaster? And this was live local radio, just after they'd announced the closure of the last nearby coal pit. So it was some time ago. And then I had to explain that although these people were born in Germany, they were actually the children of the Army of the Rhine. They were squaddies kids. But nobody else was coming to Doncaster, so your largest migrant group were the children of the British Army, based out in Germany in the past. And if nobody comes to a place like Doncaster and people leave Doncaster, things generally don't go well in Doncaster. I'm happy to talk about the issues or problems of migration, but I don't know.
All right, well, let's move on to climate change.
Okay.
What are we missing in the climate conversation? I mean, your data, or the data that you're putting together, shows that fewer people are dying from climate disasters than we might expect at the moment.
Yeah.
How do we balance realistic risk assessment of what's going on now with the necessary action we do need to take?
So the reason I worried about this was I work in a Department of Geography and the Environment. We have almost, at a good point, we may have as many as 500 staff in my department. The largest group of my colleagues are climate change scientists. That's literally where I go into work. And so I'm a bit worried, because this book's only just been published yesterday.
Yeah, I wouldn't go back.
I know. Well, I have talked to my colleagues and shown them, and one standard reaction of my colleagues when I say climate change is fifth, even when I lump loads of things together, I can't get it above fifth in the concern of the world's middle class and falling, and even falling in Britain as a concern. And their normal reaction is the question hasn't been asked properly. You know, the question should be, you know, we're all going to fry and our grandchildren won't that. How worried are you about climate change? But it's lethargy, it's crying wolf too often, it's a distant problem far away in people's minds. Near immediate problems matter. And it may be an overplaying of it. It may be too much of only 12 years to save the world. It may be bland statements, just said without thinking about it. You know, we've really got to worry about climate migrants and climate refugees. Well, we haven't had hardly any. IPCC now take that out and don't have that in their reports. They did have. You know, the crisis that went away. It's the world's poorest who suffer most from climate change. Easy to say, sounds reasonable. But then when you count it, at least in the way in which the deaths are counted by the UN body, which meticulously counts the number of deaths and people affected by every climate-affected weather disaster, the largest count of deaths are heat waves. And the people who are dying in heat waves are elderly. And the highest count of deaths of the elderly in heat waves are in Europe and in Russia and in North America. That may be the recording systems, but we have a lot of very elderly people. We're not very well adapted to the weather suddenly getting hot, and there's the deaths. And part of me thinks, well, if we did tell people, it's people like me. You know, if I were to make it another 3 decades, then this could be a 1976 again. We'll go.
I remember it.
Good. But it's that, and then, so I looked at the UN report about the number of deaths from climate change, and I took their numbers. And the number of deaths per decade in the 1950s was 77 people dying for every million alive per year due to floods and heat waves and other climate-related disasters. It then dropped in the 60s, 70s and 80s. In the 2020s so far, it's been 1 person per million per year has died due to a climate-related event. We've got many more climate-related events. We have bigger floods. But when a large amount of Pakistan floods, only, and I'm being careful, it's a lot of people, but compared to the past, if you remember the 70s, 1,600 people die. When there are floods in a country in Africa, it's 600. Because we have mobile phones and networks and, are aware, and we have weather forecasting. So telling people that this thing, which is truly scary, and it's partly scary, not just because what is absolutely predictable, but there are error rates around the predictions. But telling people to be really scared about this and we should prioritise it above everything else, well, actually, the number of people whose lives are being altered, really badly affected, not just dying, is falling, is something we haven't managed to keep up. So in recent publications, Tony Juniper's book, I think from last week, climate advocates have started talking about climate and inequality together.
So if you could ask world leaders to focus on just one thing, what would it be?
It would be controlling the billionaires.
So it would be inequality rather than climate?
Well, because their carbon footprint is so unbelievably disproportionate. There are some really, really fortunate coincidences in the world. Right? If eating meat was good for us, that would be very tricky. If eating meat added 10 or 20 years to your life, we would have a bit of a problem when it comes to the climate. But as honestly, I eat meat, I'm not having a go at you, but I do know, it'll sit in my gut and increases my chances of stomach cancer. And the less meat I eat, the healthier I'm going to be. That's good. Individual carbon footprints are unbelievably skewed like this. Most people's are tiny, and if you can get rid of their little charcoal stove, it gets even better. So redistribution money doesn't actually increase pollution, it reduces it. The majority of people in Leeds Bradford Airport on Jet 2, EasyJet, social class A, B, C, 1. When you are next on your cheap EasyJet or Ryanair flight and looking around going, we're flying with the common people, you're not. You're flying with people of your social class. Working class people don't fly. You think they do, they don't. 1% of people take 25% of all the flights a year. Once you get up into the multi-millionaires, what the hell do you do with your money? And the answer is, for some reason, almost all the hobbies and interests of multi-millionaires involve things with enormous climate footprints. One of the best things you can do is get a giant yacht with diesel engines and decide you're going to move it around the Mediterranean. That's an unbelievable footprint. Having private jets, having multiple properties. So whenever you see a reduction in income inequality, you see a population with a much lower carbon footprint. And also beginnings of understanding that you really can have a very good holiday without necessarily flying somewhere, which we're not good at in Britain. We've measured the average happiness. It's a good time of year to think about this, because you presumably are thinking about some holidays?
Just got back from mine.
Okay, I won't ask you where. We've looked at all the things which affect happiness years ago and found there are only 32 things which affect it, of which the least important is passing your driving test, but that does have a positive effect. Some things, that happiness, by the way, I'll give it away because it's really obvious when you hear it. New things, babies, new people, new relationships, promotion. Unhappiness, deaths, splitting up. Bang in the middle of this league table of what makes people happy or not are holidays, which are completely zero, utterly neutral. And this is done independently. It's not asking people. It's knowing if they've been on a holiday and looking at their change in happiness. We have, obviously, an expectation that holidays are going to be great, but the reality is such that those people who go on holidays aren't happier, I presume, because the holiday isn't always as good as you thought it would be when you're all together in that villa somewhere.
Right, we'll have that conversation later.
Yeah.
Shall we open up to the audience and take some questions and get a discussion going? I know we've got microphones at the back, thanks to our festival colleagues, So if anybody would like to ask Danny a question, do you want to raise your hand? How many do you want at a time? 2 or 3?
No, only 2.
2. Short attention span.
Yeah.
All right. Who wants to go first? They're a shy bunch. Oh, we have someone over here, 3rd row down from the back. Thank you.
I'm assuming most of the survey work is people's views about the current situation.
Yeah.
What degree of research is there about what people think the problems will be in the future, in 10, 20, 30 years' time?
Anyone else? At the back.
Thanks, Tony. I'm wondering whether, I think it's an interesting concept, and I think you've touched on this a bit, but the idea that climate change has gone down in people's concern is maybe possibly to do with it being viewed as an output rather than an input. So I think you've sort of alluded to this in terms of the fact that the rise of the billionaires and what that creates in society, an inequality. So maybe people will consider that cause of the things that are going to make climate change worse rather than the output itself. So I wonder whether that's a factor or whether it's a thing that you consider in your book as well.
Okay, just clarify that for me so I don't get it wrong. But by changes of input and output, you mean it's not that other things have come along, it's that people have begun to recognise what is making climate change worse, is that?
Yeah, it's kind of what will contribute to climate change rather than climate change itself, which is the output at the end of it in that sense. So maybe the less concern about the output, more about the things that are going to contribute to it.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, no, and I must admit, I didn't think of that. It's one of the things there's so many things you I wish I'd been clever and, yeah. So the election in America of a president who clearly doesn't believe in this and is opening up coal mines and so on. If you're worried about climate change, you're more likely to tick extreme politics or whatever as an issue. And that would make sense to me on that. And I think it's also for so many, if you remember, there was a time, and it really was still in the 90s, when this was debatable, where it wasn't absolutely certain whether we weren't going through a temporary period due to El Niños or sunspots or whatever, and it would go down. Then there were an incredible set of years in the 2000s where every year was hotter than ever. So when you see that diagram, which has blue and red for temperature, young people have it on T-shirts, and then it kind of all goes red at the end. The climate skeptics began to go quiet, if you remember this. You don't hear them much anymore. On that. On the asking people about the future, I've got one section where there is a story that was in the Observer, where if you ask people what thing they had most changed their mind about over what would matter in the future, you could get climate up there. But it was odd, because when you actually look at surveys over time, you see that people hadn't changed their mind in that direction, they changed their mind in the other. But they think they had. The standard polls we ask people about the future, and it's only one day away, is if there was an election tomorrow, how would you vote? And even for that, people actually get it remarkably wrong. We're not very good at getting ourselves out of where we are. You think you know how you would vote if there was an election tomorrow, but it's different. The problem with this argument is it's very hard to convince people that something they believe is true. Of course I know myself. I'll definitely be voting that way. But when we measure it and look at how they actually vote or said they vote the day after, it's different. The most accurate polls are exit polls. Literally a minute after walking out, you're presented with an identical polling card to the one you've just ticked, and that's accurate. One last example, or the problem about time, is that if we ask about happiness, we get different answers depending on whether we ask you how happy you are on a scale from 0 to 10 now, all things considered. 2, if we ask you how happy were you yesterday, right? And yesterday tends to be a bit lower than how you think you are now. And It's hard to be sure. So we're not very good at this. Most of us, most of the time, are not worrying about the issues in this book. I just have them because they're the ones presented. Most of us are worrying about everyday things. Right? Literally, how am I getting on with my lover, my partner, my children? The argument about work. How am I going to do mundane stuff? Many of you are beginning to worry about your bladders. Not too badly yet. But the reason that there is timing in festivals of always 1 hour is this. But you're thinking, will this man carry on talking in this monotone? Right. So the reason for saying this to you is, it's very easy for us to think you can ask people a complicated question and you're going to get a useful answer. But when we do that, we tend to find that what people say isn't what they would then say if you asked them a week later about how they're going to be in a week. These things are not the most important things on our minds.
We have a hand up in the middle, and then we have a hand up over on my left, which is your right. Thanks.
When I was young, my father had been in the army during the war, and during the war his concern was he going to give up that sort of employment and come out of it with his head life and in one piece. And my concern, when I was very young, was I going to get incinerated in a nuclear war? Those don't seem to be figuring in anybody's level of concerns much these days.
No. Let me do that one quickly.
Yeah, okay.
So the third one I have in the book after unemployment is violence and war. But war's only in there because I put in robbery and burglary and so on. And it's good, it's brilliant news. Most people in the world are not worried about war or terrorism or extremism because there isn't very much of it near to them, and there hasn't been for some time. We have had a small rise in wars in the last... Ever since Steven Pinker wrote Better Angels of Our Nature about violence going. I shouldn't. It's just... it's actually gone up. I have a terrible... well, it took ages. I've got most detailed diagram in the book is a world map with a circle for every country with the size of it, the number of war deaths since 1989, since the Berlin Wall dropping. And I'm not sure how much I should say this. I've only just started talking about this book. The map looks like a crusade. It's Muslim countries plus Rwanda, largely. So wars have been inflicted on brown people and Muslim people using weapons largely made by Christians. Maybe that'll be the last time I'll say that.
Just before we go to our next question as well, we will come to...
want to shut me up.
You show that fear of crime gets lower the further away people get from America.
Yes.
Can you just comment on that one?
Well, that, it's a bit unfair, but it's...
it's true.
It's true, and America has politically dominated South America, and the South American countries have a high rate of crime and high fear. Yeah, and you go around to get to India and China, and it's very low, and actual crime rates are very low. I don't want to blame everything on the great Satan, so I'll be... America is doing badly in all kinds of ways. It was doing badly long before Trump's first term. And you partly get Trump because it was doing so badly. So it's circular. The most interesting country about fear of crime is Sweden, where recently it went right up to the top because of some gang fights and some shooting in Stockholm. But partly because, I think, and I've got to be careful because you do epidemiology, these are things you can't prove. But a lot of things were going so well in Sweden. So when you do get some violence, it's a real shock in a country without violence. And there's been lots of really good social science work. What I do in books is I quote other people's work, which shows it's related to a rise in inequality in Stockholm. It's not related to immigration and why. But you can suddenly become worried about crimes or normal crimes, but violent crimes, if there is a rise and it continues for some time. You remember when Manchester had the highest rate of gun crime in the country and those worries back then? The highest rate, I can tell you now, is Moss Side, because we had the data. But actually 1 person per year was being shot in Moss Side. You know, so you were still at much more risk crossing the road in Moss Side than of being shot. But you can. Knife crime as well. And it's obvious when you see it. Countries bordering countries at war, particularly Ukraine being invaded, but also around the Middle East. That's where the rise and the realisation suddenly rises. And lastly, if you do a separate poll and ask the world's population as well as you can how much they fear nuclear war, and just that, you will get 50% still being frightened. It's not broken down by age. I'd love to see it broken down by age, because it was my main fear from about age 13 to about 40.
Well, that's because they kept telling us we'd have to get under the table if it happened, wasn't it?
It's because Oxford was surrounded by American cruise missile bases.
Should we take our question over here?
I don't know quite how to phrase this, but are we right? All this worry and crisis and whatever, is that rendering us inactive? And are we standing by because it's all too big? And any little drop that we do is not enough to sort anything out, to stop it, to stop being so stupid and senseless and shooting ourselves in the foot and being just blatantly humanity's down the drain without a paddle, unless we start having common sense about these crises and say, if we want to live happier lives, then we have to stop doing X, Y, and Z. Where is this inactivity and lack of common sense coming from, and what are we going to do about it?
It's a great question. I've thought about this, about whether this is paralysing. And to try to answer that, you've got to look at what do we actually do, what have we done, are we doing things globally? It's very depressing if you just look at Britain. But are we doing things at a less or greater rate than before that were affected? I think what has happened is I've got to find a better way. It's like there's been an enormous expansion of the Bloomsbury set, and suddenly millions of us are allowed in the conversation about worrying about big problems. Whereas if you think back in the 1920s and 30s, the kind of issues about what are the biggest crises will be that isn't something you talk down the pub about. You know, that was for the clever ups, the ones who passed 11 plus at BG University, which was only 1% of people. And I think part of what's happening is this realisation that there aren't any special John Maynard Keyneses out there to help solve the problem for us. So it's not paralysing. Solutions take decades, if not generations, and we think we can alter things quickly. So the realisation across the planet that our biggest problem is cost of living, inequality and poverty, getting to that over about 20 years is a major achievement. If you don't see it as a problem, if you believe the people who used to tell you that it was a sign of success, you were rewarding the tall poppies, you were rewarding talent. The wealth creators were going to save us all, you've just got to let them get their wealth. You know, it's taken us time, and it's right to be impatient. Nuclear weapons. Really short amount of time between the realisation that you could do this and the time we first dropped one in 1945. Very, very tiny amount of time. It took between 1945 and the 1980s to actually agree. Ronald Reagan, you know, hardly a genius, but his advisors, to agree to dismantle close to 90% of them, which is what we did. The problem is the 10% are still incredibly dangerous. But we did that. Or to give you another example of how we solve things, or realise that a crisis isn't a crisis. If you go back again 100 years, one of the biggest crises in the world, agreed by the key thinkers on the left and on the right, the great crisis was that the working classes were breeding too much and the middle classes weren't. and we were going to get a giant residuum of stupid people. And the eugenics was true. And the eugenics was a major crisis, that we needed eugenics to improve things. That's why Mike just died. Thank you. So, it is absolutely vital to be angry and impatient and want change, but I think we overestimate how fast good change tends to come. The last example I'll give you is the changing position of women.
You're on again.
I'm on.
I'm not back.
Can I? No. It might be on because he's turned that on. Let's just try both and see how we go. The changing position of women, right? To go from my grandmother being seen as subhuman to the point at which we are now required people arguing for it. It wasn't that men suddenly went, oh yes, of course women are very clever, we'll include them as well, right? It didn't happen that fast. It hasn't all been completed yet. Easy things like the ozone hole, which are still hard enough, but all you've got to do is remove the worst of the CFCs. There is an alternative for making fridges work. We can deal with that. Even Margaret Thatcher understood about the ozone hole. It's always put forward, wasn't she a brilliant chemist? Right? But most of our problems are a little bit harder to deal with than simply changing the cooling mechanism of a fridge. But I err on optimism. I don't think we're doomed. And it gets depressing, but if you look through the worst things we've done, it could have been far worse. The biggest fear is World War III, if you like it in one way, which we tend not to think about because we do think we hope we have enough people who will help avert it and have been involved in averting in the past. We could be so much better than this. But we are a species learning really, really quickly about ourselves and our planet. I was taught at school that to get an A at A-level geography, which I got, to get an A, I had to write about the cooling that was about to happen because of the ice age that was going to come in 1986. Right? So, we're learning, and our impatience is really good. It's very fortunate that being rich doesn't make you happy, that eating meat isn't good for you. It's incredibly fortunate, but it's more to do with advocacy and the rising position of women, that for the youngest person in this room, who's got the laptop up, for the youngest person in this room, you're going to see human population fall for the first time in the history of our species on the planet. There are lots and lots of good things in our favour, but it would be useful if we addressed the bad things a bit more systematically and quicker, partly because selfishly I've only got 20 or 30 years left to go at most, and I'd like to see some of these actually improve, because many of them are very old problems. Poverty and inequality is an old problem that we've addressed many times before. World religions try to address it. War is very old. And the idea that we might tolerate it or increase defence spending to 3%, and people don't go, oh, come on, haven't we learnt? We need more and more of that.
Any questions over here? I've got a question about halfway down. Of course, I'm holding your microphone now, aren't I? Sorry, I should have got up and run.
There's one coming around from the top.
Thank you. When you were talking about climate change earlier, the analogy came to me was the man who jumped out of the skyscraper, and halfway down he said it all going really well. And I feel that's an example of the danger of this sort of analysis. If we sit in a democratic society, I would expect my leaders not to be influenced by public opinion, but actually be influenced by more knowledge and more experience and more evidence. But all of this stuff just suggests to me that we can't carry on in a democratic world when populist ideas influence politicians who therefore do the things that we know they shouldn't do. I just wonder whether you have any other
Thoughts on democracy?
Thoughts on, well, there's been some polls recently which show a majority of young men not wanting democracy in in various countries. It's really interesting where young women are going. I get in trouble when I say this. In Germany, women under 24 are 3 times more likely to be green or left. And then the thing, which I get in trouble for, saying, if I was a young man in Germany now, and I liked
join
women...
the Green Party, wouldn't you?
Just to meet women, but anyway. Don't ever say that at school as well, they really tell you off. The children tell you off. It's great, they're confident. I don't just look at opinion polls. So I look at what the risk analysts say at Davos, and I've been through lots of pages of IPCC. And what's fascinating with IPCC is, and it's completely understandable, they have more certainty about the future because every sentence is given a probability that they have to vote on than they have about what's happened in the past. And partly because there's a kind of, well, we have to agree, we don't know, but we're going to agree. Whereas on the past, we've got more evidence, actual evidence, and people look at it and go, no, I think you're wrong, you're wrong. The biggest problem with climate change is the middle-class young of Europe who largely believe it's game over. That their views on climate change are, it's too late, you've wrecked our futures. And then you get a nihilism that's occurring. I can't see a benevolent world dictatorship or government. Dictators tend not to have the wider interests of people at heart. They might be somebody who started off with that, but analysis of dictators tends to show that the longer they stay being a dictator, the nastier they actually get. Orban at one point might have been a reasonable person arguing interesting cases. The longer he's sitting in Hungary, the more corruption you get and the worse the situation becomes. Even your best read and wise dictators, humans. So I don't think it exists. So we need the young middle class of Europe to think it is possible that we could have children and grandchildren, and that our grandchildren, or at least our great-grandchildren, could be living in a better situation than we are, if we work together to get it. You haven't mentioned the last chapter in the book, which is biodiversity and species extinction. Because climate change will end. It's just what state are we going to be in? But it will end. There's a limit to how much coal and oil we can burn and get out. The thing that the experts who really know worry about most are the species we can never bring back and the damage that will never reverse. But I really had to work hard banging together different things to even get that up, because in the world's consciousness, the environment, other than climate change, is very, very far away. And one message might be, we need to diminish the importance and the actual fear from these other things, because I'm going to plug Kate's book.
Oh, thank you.
Basic Income, the policy that changes everything. With this, you don't have to fear unemployment anymore. You might fear, am I going to give me a job that fits my status or my education? But if we were, whichever place in the world first brings it in, it's ridiculous. It's as ridiculous as the idea of unemployment benefits were when first postulated in the 1880s. And of course you have them now. So we have to solve, or at least begin to mitigate, the things that are at the top of people's heads to give them space to worry about these other things. That would be my argument. You're not going to get a benign world dictatorship, or the closest you have to it in the world is the Chinese Communist Party, which is currently greening more than any other, which is building the most enormous parks within cities, cleaning up the rivers and so on, because it wants a happy and contented population, because in China there's only 2 ways in which you can get rid of your government: a revolution or a civil war. It's a much bigger incentive to do well as a politician than an election where all that happens is you're out of power for 4 years. But I'm not going to advocate that we let the Chinese Communist Party take over the world, no matter how good, because their record is only partly good because they're exploiting the rest of the world in buying the things that they're so good at making.
So we're out of time, but let's just finish by saying you've dedicated this book to students who have taught me over many years, you say.
Yeah.
What's the most important thing they have taught you?
It's the, you know, I don't know, you'll know this. We get students to fill in surveys where they write things after we lecture them, and at certain points in your career, this is the worst day of your life when you read what they write, and then halfway through your career, you stop reading them entirely, and people, and then they do, and then you start reading them again. And some of them are so astute. So students really are much more interested than they appear to be, which you'll know if you have children or grandchildren at university. You'll know how obsessed they are about getting 58 on this, and that they actually read and they watch the lecture even if they're in bed, and it's, you know, on a thing. So it's being corrected by students for making jokes about young men and young women and political parties, but it's also recognising their real fears and the rise of mental ill health, which you see if you know, I've been exposed since I was 21 to 18-year-olds staying 18 every year. Right? I get older, they stay the same. And they are much more nervous and worried and concerned than they were. And I partly wrote the book to try and say this standard thing that old people say, which is really annoying. It's just, well, let's just take all your problems and let's put them in order and see what we can do about them. So it's an attempt to do that, because they are going to be the ones who are going to have to solve this. You know, we are the ones who have mucked it up. In the UK, more than almost anywhere else in Europe, you know, it wasn't that we had the most amazing, brilliant, clever Conservative Party in the 80s. We had the most disorganised, not getting on left wing. But it's too late. We did that. We need the students to work out how to do better than we did. And the least we can do is try to be honest about what we actually think.
Thank you. Thanks, Danny. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thanks for answering questions, great questions from our audience members. I'm sure lots of you here today are going to want to get your hands on a copy of Danny's book, which is for sale in the foyer out there, as well as a number of Danny's other books. How many have you written now?
59.
59.
Yeah.
I'll tell you now what my most recent big fear was. I had a dream the other night, and in my dream, my editor rang me up and she said, about your next book, Kate, it's not going to work. That's my big fear at the moment. But I think when you write as many as you do, that's not the kind of thing you worry about. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Be sure to check out what else is coming up in the festival programme. If you enjoyed this event, I'm going to be joining a really good lineup of speakers for a special focus day on Friday, sponsored by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in the Guildhall. It's called Making Waves, Building on Joseph Rowntree's Legacy. So do come along to that day as you can. There are panels throughout the day. So all that remains is me to thank Danny again, ask you to join me in thanking him for his great talk.